Hello and welcome to the channel. I'm the Sandman and I am joined today by Dan from Dan Brewster, the YouTube channel. Dan, how are you today, mate?
I'm doing wonderful. Yeah, I don't have quite a good brand yet, so it's just my name.
Yeah. So, you are a beloved son of Sanguinius. I think I'm right in saying. And how come you're a big fan of the Blood Angels, can I ask?
Yeah, so I'm actually a huge fan of melee armies. The first army I ever played was Sisters of Battle, and I kept wanting to charge my opponent. So I'd play against like Tyranids, right? I would always charge them because it just felt natural. It's like what I wanted to do. That was not the right play, to charge my Sisters of Battle into like, you know, these giant Tyranid beasts. Eventually I was like, well, if I really want to play a combat army, why don't I play a combat army, right? Instead of trying to just charge my Sisters of Battle, you know, into these Tyranids. So I ended up switching to Blood Angels, and they're a pretty cheap army to collect. Definitely elite, less painting, less money.
True, yeah.
And I think it's a good intro army for anyone out there if they like melee armies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point actually, and segues us on quite nicely to the topic of today, which is how to play combat armies. And if you look back to say 8th edition, there wasn't really many armies that were combat based or had limited shooting, shall we say. But in 9th edition, we've seen a bit of a turnaround here. We've got many more armies in the meta that are predominantly combat or have a significant combat element. So Dan, take us away. What's your first tip for playing a combat-oriented army?
Yeah, the first tip I have is leveraging terrain and kind of playing to your army's strengths and not how your opponent wants to play. You made a really good point about 9th edition. What I have noticed is that a lot of shooting and just combat, attacks in general are very deadly, and you can wipe squads relatively easily if you're able to shoot your entire army or attack your entire army against someone. In 9th edition, it seems more deadly, but at the same time, we got these obscuring pieces of terrain which totally block line of sight. So you really have to play finesse when you're playing a melee army. Example I use is like a Civil War or World War, not World War I, but an old Napoleonics, where your opponent lines up all their shooting and you line up all your melee guys, and you march forward and they shoot you, and then you hope that you're just going to even out when you get in melee. That's just simply not going to work because of how deadly shooting is. So my number one tip is about leveraging terrain and kind of using them to hop forward. I think it's really important that you play on boards that have obscuring pieces of terrain that allow you to slowly move up your forces in order to get in melee.
And I guess it's worth pointing out as well at this point that is what Games Workshop do recommend. They do have recommended terrain now. And yeah, if you look at those example boards, you can absolutely see there is space to hop up across the board. You don't have to just stand in the open, ideally. Any other examples there of things you can do around terrain or little movements that you can do that really help out?
Yeah, so there's a couple different pieces for like leveraging terrain. One of them is ideally you don't want to get shot. If you can avoid getting shot entirely, that's your number one goal. And if you can't avoid being shot, you want to make yourself more defensible. So that means being inside cover for like ruins, or having your opponent shoot through dense cover so they get -1 to hit. And if you can't do any of those things, then you want your unimportant units or your chaff units to be the ones that are getting shot.
Yeah.
Try to hide the most important things, make the medium ones more defensible, and then if it's a chaff unit or whatever, they can die. But you really have to be like hopping between terrain of those obscuring pieces of terrain if you want to get into melee. There's also another couple interesting tricks you can use, where depending on like the size of walls, you can actually prevent units from getting in melee with you. And this is one of the things I've talked about before, but engagement range is 1 inch. And sometimes ruins are pretty thick. If you have a ruin made out of styrofoam, it could be 1/2 inch thick. And then if you're on the other side of that styrofoam and there's not any space for your opponent's base, but they also can't get within 1 inch of your model from the other side of the terrain, then they can't attack you in melee. And if there's no windows on that piece of terrain, then they can't shoot you either, and that's exactly where you want to be.
Yeah, you'll definitely notice that as you play like higher level players. People will just say, for purposes of time, oh, by the way, 1/2 inch back from the wall here, and then that's exactly what they're going for when they do that. So yeah, that's a really big one, and yeah, it's about positioning yourself for when you can get that reliable charge, as you say. Okay, awesome. So yeah, point number 2, mate. What were you thinking?
Yeah, number 2 is, as much as I like melee armies, you really can't go all in. And this kind of comes down to the idea of trading with your opponent. So for example, with Blood Angels, I've got units of Sanguinary Guard, and I like to take them in units of 7, which is about 230 points. Now, if I'm using that 230 point unit of Sanguinary Guard, which can blender like almost anything in the game, obviously if they have -1 damage, it's a little bit harder, but they are very, very strong in melee. And if I'm using that to kill someone's 10-man unit of guardsmen, that is a poor trade. You don't need to be a pro player to know that trading 250 points for 50 points is not a good play. And the way you can actually prevent yourself from taking those bad trades is by having something that can kill the chaff units. Kill those units of guardsmen or blood brothers or, whatever it is that's going to protect the targets you actually want to hit. So it's funny that, in a video about melee tips, we're talking about shooting, but if you take 2,000 points of melee, you're going to be generally, especially if there are any expensive melee units, you're going to have to make these really low, we call them like bad expected value charges, essentially, where you're trading down. So although I really like melee, I'd like to have about like maybe 1/3 to 1/4 of my list be a kind of dedicated shooting units. So in my list, I tend to take about 2 Redemptors and then 1 unit of Bolter and Scepters. And I find that those are very useful in clearing chaff units, even like kind of like those 2 health, Marine Intercessors. Like that's what I plan on killing, and then saving those big melee units for things that I actually want to go after.
We haven't had many Horde codexes out so far, and that's going to be a bigger thing when those kind of things come around, because you can't have those Sanguinary Guard just hitting termagants. You want the card effects behind them, for example. And absolutely, we are seeing kind of an MSU style meta at the moment, and that typically happens in most editions of Warhammer. And the reason for that is exactly as you say. Despite the temptation to take a big blob of Sanguinary Guard and be like, well, I'm going to put all the buffs on them for my characters and the stratagems or whatever it's going to be, that actually you're going to have those matchups that you really struggle with. A 10-man Sanguinary squad is going to auto-kill anything in the game. It doesn't matter what it's against. So if your opponent positions cleverly, then you're going to be out of luck, I think, there.
Well, it's one thing that people always talk about, when they're talking about how a game is going to go. They like to say things like, oh, well, my unit of Sanguinary Guard would charge that key unit and I would kill them. And that's kind of like the way they're thinking, but they're not realizing that your opponent gets a vote. Your opponent is a smart person. Either they're a bad person, you're going to win regardless, or they're a smart person and you got to play correctly, right? And so I like to believe that my opponents are smart and they're going to do the right thing. And if you just think, oh, well, if my opponent lets me get these charges, if they put their key unit in the open, then my unit can do its cool thing. That is you're setting yourself up for failure on that one, for sure.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it's a really good point.
And I think it comes down to a little bit of, practice and based on the meta. For example, like you said, we haven't seen a lot of those Horde codexes, maybe Tyranids, or really, obviously Orcs has come out, but we haven't seen a whole lot of games with them, especially with like new like lots of boys or how that might look. But you definitely have to think like, if I need to clear one full unit, like if they're very smart and they're going to take units and take casualties in a smart way, what do I need to kill an entire chaff unit for each charge I'm willing to make? And I think you can get that by playing enough games, doing some math beforehand, and then figuring out for your own army and your own list how much shooting you reasonably need to do to ensure that your key melee units can actually get those charges off.
And so, on to, I guess, point 3 then.
Yeah, so one of the things I like to talk about in a lot of my videos and a lot of my kind of practice games is trying to figure out who the aggro is. And I think too often people think if there's a melee army and there's a ranged army, the melee army has to come to the ranged army because that's how they attack. I don't think that is how it actually works in Warhammer 40K because of things like secondary and primary. One of the things I like to figure out in every game I'm playing is who is the person who would win the game if no one did anything. Or even a simple one, if all they did was trade off who owned the middle objective, and just like, throw a guy up, it died, threw another guy up, it died. Who would win the game at the end of the game? So if I'm playing something like Blood Angels, and I have, To the Last, I have Stranglehold and Oath of Moments, all I need to hold is the middle objective, and I can max out all my secondaries without ever going past that middle point of the board. And if I'm going against someone who, let's say, is playing like an Ultramarines shooting list, but they're taking Retrieve Octarius Data and engage on all fronts, well, then they need to get into my quarters. So in reality, I can win the game by never actually going beyond that midpoint. So even though I'm the melee army and they're the shooting army, in reality, they're the ones who has to change how the game is going to win. So just by being the melee army does not mean you need to throw yourself towards their deployment zone. You can play the waiting game and make them come to you, leverage that terrain, if you can sit back and score more points than them by doing nothing.
I think that's huge. I think that's why it's really important to have that kind of pre-game strategy when you see the mission and the terrain. It's been said time and time again, I think, about Ninth, which is that you can win a game without firing a shot or revving a chainsaw. It's totally possible to win this game just because you've got movement secondaries, and secondaries maybe require you to stay alive and hold points. If you're looking at terrain and thinking, right, so I can actually get onto that terrain piece every single turn, get Stranglehold every single turn, get some object onto that point, and I can stay in cover. Okay, I don't think I need to go towards my opponent's deployment zone every single game in this matchup. So it's a really interesting one.
Well, it reminds me of a game I watched on stream that was actually at LVO. It wasn't like the finals, but it was pretty close to it. It was maybe like the top 8. So very, very good players. And they were both sitting in their deployment zone, and they sat there. Each person didn't do anything for probably the first 3 turns. And then one of them realized, he said something on the stream, he was like, wait, I'm gonna lose. And you know what I mean? He was a melee army, or he was like a Dark Eldar Flyers army against some melee army, and he was like, wait, I'm gonna lose. And he was so afraid of getting close that he sat back and then didn't realize till the game was almost over and it was essentially unwinnable that he was gonna lose because he was so afraid of getting in melee.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It really does depend on secondary choices, etc. And that's why, these reps are really important, I guess. I mentioned it before on the channel. One of the most important things you can do is just play the game. And you'll see this if you just try it sometime. See how it goes. What top players will do is they will practice these games of, okay, so what happens if I just play my objectives and, like you say, maybe that middle objective as well. And it's really worth having that game because you'll be pleasantly surprised, I think.
You don't win the game by tabling your opponent, you win the game by scoring more points. And sometimes the easiest way to score points is just focusing on your secondaries and primaries. It's all good to deny your opponent, but sometimes standing still and hiding yourself is the best way to deploy. Certainly if they're taking kill objectives or movement objectives that involves getting into your backfield, and you've got things like To the Last, Oath of Moments, like you can take a lot of really defensive secondaries.
And so what's the final point you're thinking of, Dan, for tips for combat?
Yeah, the final point is about mastering the combat phase movements. So one of the things I've heard a lot of really good players that I respect say is that Warhammer 40K is one in the movement phase, and the combat phase is the second movement phase. And I think that's kind of an important distinction because it goes back to the idea that we were just talking about where you don't necessarily win because you killed more guys than your opponent, you won because you scored more points. And there's a lot of different tips and tricks that you can do in the combat phase that will blow your mind if you haven't seen them. One of the most obvious ones that you hear about is called wrapping and trapping. And this kind of abuses the rule where a unit that is engaged in combat can't shoot and can't be shot at. In Warhammer 40k, you can't move through your opponent's models unless you use the Desperate Breakout 2CP stratagem. So in other words, if you have 3 points of contact, kind of like a triangle around somebody else's base with your models, they can't move outside of combat with you. And so you can use this kind of wrapping and trapping tactic to prevent your own models from being shot and stay locked in on combat. So that's one kind of easy tip. Another one is that you get an extra 6 inches of your movement, essentially. After you charge, you get to pile in 3 inches, and you get to consolidate 3 inches. And it only says that you have to move closer to the nearest model. It doesn't say you have to move directly closer. So you can do a lot of little surfing and specific maneuvering in order to get on objectives. So it's really important that you take advantage of the fact that as a combat army, you almost have 2 movement phases a turn, and if you can take advantage of that, you're going to run around armies in ways you haven't seen before. If you play against a really good player in the combat phase, you will be surprised at all the cool things they can do to you.
When you play Warhammer at a tournament or something, you should pre-measure a lot. And if you watch for example, the Warhammer streams of like the US Open, you'll see they spend a lot of time pre-measuring before they move any models. Now, when you do that, of course, one of the things you're going to be looking for is how long is my charge going to be? Perfectly reasonable. However, do make sure you're measuring how far can I move this turn if I pile in and consolidate, because I've done it, we've all done it, where we forgot to properly utilize our pile in and consolidate. But if you have it into your head at the start of the turn and think, oh, actually, so through pile in and consolidate, I can be on that objective, that will change your entire tactic for this turn and your strategy going forward, because now you know, oh, right, okay, so actually I'm going to be on 3 objectives. That will mean that, oh, maybe you don't have to be as aggressive in a different part of the board or whatever it's going to be. So I think it's really important, as you say, do start off your turn thinking about your entire movement, because it is a second movement phase.
Yeah, and there's some tricks too in terms of just like moving behind. Because like, let's say you're 5 inches away from an enemy model. Well, you can move 3 inches laterally and be 4.99 inches away, and you still met the intent. You moved closer, but you also moved behind a piece of terrain.
Yeah.
And so there's a lot of really interesting things you can do in game with those pilot and consolidates, where you essentially can hide your units, you can move on to objectives, you can try point a unit so it can't run away. There's a lot of different things you can take advantage of.
Yeah, hiding is probably the one I use the most when I'm playing GSC, because of course my stuff is very easy to kill. That's huge. Like that's another unit I've potentially got in my next turn.
And one of the ways I've gotten totally punished before is with like the combat interrupt and kind of my opponent abusing that movement phase. So I charged one of my Invictors against, I can't remember exactly what it was, but basically my opponent got the combat interrupt. They piled in 3 inches, killed my guy, consolidated 3 inches forward, and then what I originally thought was going to be like an 18-inch charge, like a max threat range charge, ended up being a 6-inch charge. And I realized I had given him, in my turn, 6 inches of extra movement because he also got to do the combat interrupt in my turn. It changed the game after he did that because I gave my opponent a movement phase in my turn thanks to combat interrupt.
And I guess actually that does go back to your previous point about not committing everything all at once, because you need to have your eye on that interrupt all the time. You need to think, all right, so if I can make 2 charges this turn, but my opponent is just going to spend 2 CP to kill the second unit.
I will very rarely charge with only 2 units. It's either 1 or it's my entire army, because combat interrupt, if you're playing against anyone who has reasonable melee, it is so punishing.
Definitely one to keep an eye on, as I say. Cool. Was there anything else you wanted to mention?
One last thing, this is kind of a bonus one for you, is about charges and what you're willing to, kind of the risk you're willing to take. For me, I don't like doing any kind of a roll or any type of risk in Warhammer 40K. It's under like a 75% chance. If I'm going to be stringing together multiple 75% chances, you can do the math out pretty quickly. It becomes under a 50% chance very, very quickly. And so I don't like to take 9-inch, rerollable charges from Deep Strike, because about half the time your unit is out and dead, and about half the time you get a decent charge, and that's just not where you want to be. One content creator I really like, one of the things he said is, when asked about charges, he was like, well, I almost never fail a charge. And the reason is because he doesn't take low probability charges. So I highly recommend, just because you can take a 9-inch charge or something like that, I would not recommend basing your game plan on sub 75% chance rolls.
You very rarely hear top tournament players complaining about luck.
Yep.
That's because they just don't take the risks, and that goes into everything that they do. Well, yes, thank you so much, Dan. Thanks so much for coming on. We've also recorded a video that will be on your channel either already or going on shortly, I'm sure. So yeah, do check that out. Dan's got some amazing videos on mistakes people make when they play 40k, and they've been really popular for a very, very good reason. It covers some really important topics that you need to know if you're a melee army or otherwise. So yeah, do check him out. Thanks for coming on again, Dan.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate coming on.
And thank you for watching this video. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you for the next one.